I never decided to become an artist. As the son of a nice middle-class family, I was to do what we were all supposed to do in our neighborhood, which was to get a decent paying profession, right? Artists were European, dead, or crazy. At least that's what my aunt said. And she was probably right. So the idea of being an artist was never part of what I did. Although I did art classes in high school, it was really only because my friend did them. So I did them too, and I enjoyed them, right? So that's kind of the way things worked. It wasn't really a conscious decision. But when I went to university, I took the series of courses that would lead into a program in architecture, a nice profession, right? You're allowed to do that. You're not allowed to become an artist. But a series of events occurred which shifted and changed, and partly because I wasn't very good at physics, so I wouldn't be able to finish the pre-architecture program in 3 years. But also I got very excited by art, and particularly art history, which is what I was studying. I took a few studio courses, but there was no BFA program at that time or MFA program at UBC. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was any MFA program at that time in British Columbia. This was in 1967 to 71 when I was a student. I graduated in 1971 with a BA in art history. And through that, met some people, including Ian Wallace, who was one of my teachers and was a tremendous teacher. B.C. Binning, who impressed everyone by his dignity and his absolute kindness. And perhaps more importantly, Doris Shadbolt, who was an adjunct professor at the university for several years, from her role as chief curator and director, eventually director, of the Vancouver Art Gallery at that time. Well, a number of us were in a series of classes in second year, which we really enjoyed, and I began to audit Ian Wallace's classes. But at the end of that second year, which a lot of us were quite serious about art making, we realized that there was no third-year art classes that one could take except for one called Historical Methods, which was taught by the late Lionel Thomas, and by all accounts was extraordinarily dull. And then there was also Analysis of Style through Drawing. So that was it, and it was just really limited. So we petitioned our previous teacher from that previous year, who happened to be Tony Onley, and said, Tony, we would like to do more art. Now, this was 1969, it would have been, at a time when the kind of rules and regulations at the university were vastly reduced from what they are now. The bureaucracy wasn't as intense, and it was very efficient. And so Tony Onley said, well, you know, what I can do is I can offer a course, but I don't know where we teach it. I'll just see if we can get it through everything all really quickly. We had a new head of department that year who was from England and knew nothing about the system here. So he just said yes to everything. You know, it was great. So he said yes to the course. And then so Tony just cut to the chase to solve the problem. And he walked over to the president's office, said, I'd like to speak to the president, who happened to be Dean Walter Gage, a very, very fine president at the time, and had also been my first year math teacher. And he was such a good teacher that he even could teach me calculus. He was good. At any rate, Tony Onley went over to the president's office and said, well, we'd like to teach this course. We don't know where to do it. And apparently Walter Gage looked at him and said, well, you know, I think that house over behind the library called Field House is open. It's not being used right now. Why don't you just go and get a bunch of keys and give each student a key, and they can use it 24 hours a day if they wish. They wouldn't do that now, I'll tell you. So it all happened within like 2 days. So we had this course, we all sort of invented the course ourselves, and Tony would drop by once a week to talk to us. But basically what it was, you had this group of about 10 or 11 young individuals excited about making art and just made it, right? It wasn't like a course. So it was just tremendous, and it sort of started our community, and some significant individuals in that. For example, Max Dean was in that, right? And Max Dean, now a very well-known artist in Ontario. Dean Ellis, who practiced as an artist for a while and then later became a very successful land developer, and so on. Just a number of individuals were very excited by what they were doing. Well, that worked out very well, and then the next year we did the same kind of sleight of hand with this new head of department. And Doris Shadbolt was offering a course, it was a graduate course in Canadian art history. Well, as undergraduate students, we weren't really supposed to take it, but we went to the head of the department and said, would it be possible that we as undergraduates could take the course? And your course says, of course you can. Yes, you take any course you like. So, well, we take the course. And in that course, the course was being given in a room in the library, a seminar room. So we met there with Doris Shadwell for the first class. And she said, well, I'd like to make a couple of changes to this situation, if you don't mind. First of all, I'd like not to hold it here in the library, because it's hard for me to get out from the gallery. I would like to hold it in the gallery, in the Vancouver Art Gallery. So we'll meet there once a week, and we'll do everything. And this is the other change, is it won't be about all of contemporary Canadian art history, even historical art history. Why don't we base it on the shows that are coming into the gallery? So you'll study what you see, we'll talk about it, you'll give presentations, we'll talk to the artists. Well, it's tremendous, absolutely tremendous, because all of a sudden, as undergraduates, we were dealing with, well, what you should be dealing with in terms of studying contemporary history, which was dealing with artists, looking at their work, looking at contemporary sources and journals, and doing research in a very serious way, and it was just marvelous. Well, as things would have it, we were all pretty excited, and at the end of the year, we were so happy with, working with Doris, who was just a tremendous person to work with in this one. And we all felt kind of like members of the family almost, down at the art gallery, and she took 4 of us aside, and she had seen what we'd been doing because we had given her a gift at the end of the course that looked like the display cases that they had for the, storage cases they had for the art gallery, and we'd all contributed things to it. And she later approached 4 of us privately and said, look, if you 4 are still making art after a year, and I like what you're doing, I'll give you a show at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Here I am just graduating, getting a job as an architectural model maker, and, which was great, tremendous learning experience in Vancouver is a wonderful thing to do, because of course I was still intending to go into architecture. So I just started to continue working as I was doing, and in the little tiny area of our apartment, which my wife and I shared in an old tenement building, which was splendid because the landlord knew it was going to be bulldozed as soon as we moved out, so we didn't care what we did with it, and also working in my father's basement. My father had tools because he was, as I might have mentioned, a high school shop teacher, and my mother was a maker of things, so it was very easy to continue. And so I applied for a Canada Council grant to become, to develop work for the show, so I didn't have to work all till the very end of it as an architectural model maker. So I worked as a model maker for a year and a bit, and then took some time off and made work for the show, and the show luckily got reviewed, and an article written in what was then the premier art magazine in Canada, now called Canadian Art, but at that time called Arts Canada. And I had this kind of instant career thrust on me. It was just like, what am I doing? And incidentally, that was 40 years ago, this month, that I had that first show. So the question was asked, and it's often asked, where do you get your ideas? I think that's probably the first question that people ask most artists when they have a chance to speak to them, and particularly when they've had a chance to see their work directly. And I think it's because we often assume that there's some kind of formula by which artists are able to invent their ideas. But it's really not really that much different than going into the kitchen and deciding what to make. And particularly if you're inventing a recipe, you go in there and say, I think I want to see if I like the soup I had before, but I'm going to change that soup. I don't want to spice it up a bit. I want to throw some curry into it. So you're doing the same kind of invention that artists do, because one tends to get one's ideas from the entire world. But obviously, part of that entire world is your own work. So you tend to get your ideas from what you've been doing before, but of course you don't make the same thing over and over and over again. What you're doing is adding to new work all those other influences that are coming to you, such as what you read in the newspaper, what you might read in a journal or magazine, what conversations you have with people, even idle conversations. What are you watching on television? What movies have you seen? What music are you listening to? All of those things start to give you ideas, even chance things like you're walking down the street and, or in my case, more dangerously, it happens when I'm driving. And you all of a sudden, an idea comes to you, and so you stop, pull over, or wait for a stoplight, and you note it on a notepad. But it may have been triggered by something as simple as the flight of a bird right by your windscreen, and you say, oh, I'm so glad it didn't hit that bird. But what you suddenly realize is that bird triggered a thought about a bird you were reading in a novel or in something you knew from poetry, and something will flood into your head. And it's a contemplative process. It's one where you kind of have a bunch of ideas floating around in your head, and then all of a sudden, some of them just kind of lock together, right? And then, lo and behold, you have a seed for something which you develop, and that seed is very much like the same seed you would have in a snowball. As you roll along with that little seed, it eventually becomes larger and larger and larger, and lo and behold, you have a beautiful and perfectly spherical snowball, right? That's how it works, right? At least how it works for me, and I'm sure every artist has a slightly different way of doing it, because no two people make art the same way, right? And some people are inspired and they know very definitely what they're inspired by, but I think probably the main influence on my work is looking around me at the entire world, including a lot of other artworks. Artists are always looking through sources to look at artworks, whether they go to galleries or through journals or now on the internet. But in my case, also reading. A lot of it comes from reading, and I read extensively, and I always have. And I was very lucky to learn to read very young and learn to read quickly very young, because of that, books have always been a big part of my life, right? So that reading isn't a chore. Reading is like watching a movie, right? Just there it is, right? And it's got all the presents you might want. Well, this exhibition, Telling Stories with Digressions, didn't develop as that. It developed after having done a previous exhibition in 2004 at the Kelowna Art Gallery, and then later shown at the Equinox Gallery in Vancouver, called A Taxonomy of Islands, which had a lot of imagery about islands. Some were drawings, some were prints and whatnot, based on some photographs I'd taken, and others were sculptural items. And in doing that show, you kind of run through a series of ideas. Then you take a little time off and you do normal things like, painting the house or, fixing the furniture, that kind of thing. And then one day, I was just kind of back in my workshop, and we had at one time in our house had this column, a wooden column that had been made for a front porch of a house in Vancouver, probably in the very early part of the 20th century. And it was stained, but still quite beautiful. And that was sitting in my workshop at school because I realized that it wasn't sensible to have it at home. Well, I didn't realize, my wife realized it wasn't sensible to have it at home because we were taking a lot of care of our niece, who was a toddler at the time. And you don't have a tippy column with a 2-year-old, right? Not good. And so I felt, well, take it away. So I took it out to my shop, and we were not quite sure what to do with it. Then one day I was just looking at it, and all of a sudden it came to me, in combination with some other things I had lying around, that, gee, this would be what I could do with this. And lo and behold, we have the work in the gallery called A Device to Explain Something, right? So that's how you get your ideas. Now, obviously, if you look at the work, you realize that the prime imagery of that is a machine called the orrery. And I've done a few works in the past using that image of the orrery. But this is kind of a working orrery. It actually works. You can turn it a little crank. Well, actually you can't. We put it so you can't touch it. But if you could, right, you would turn that crank, and of course the things would move around. And so that's kind of how things start, that you say, well, okay, let's do this, let's do this. And then you do the next one, and then you do the next one. And then eventually you ask a curator to come and look at the work, as I did with Liz Wiley, and she very kindly came down to my studio and looked at it. And we talked and arranged this exhibition. And then I just continued making work for it. But for example, the title of the show was probably invented only 2 or 3 months ago. It's not how I conceived of the work. The work wasn't conceived to answer the question. The title was, in a sense, distilled out of the works I had made based on ideas and realizations about basically how we get all of our knowledge, how we learn things. Well, you learn them starting from infancy almost, mostly through words people have said to you, right? Or words you've read, right? They're all stories. Now, I've been teaching adults since 1973. So all of my work in teaching those adults is telling them stories. What is the nature of this painting by Rembrandt? Why are we looking at his self-portraits, right? Why do we look at this drawing he did of his son, right? And so on. And every time you're doing that, you're talking about a story, or even something about trying to explain to a student how to use a piece of machinery to do something safely. You're telling them a story about their actions. So we are stories. We are made from stories. And when you think about it, your entire consciousness, as you're sitting there, is stories, right? That's what it is. In my mind, there's actually no difference. But sculpture is often thought of as tending to be more unified and unitary. Installation work is often conceived of as being all over the place and bits and pieces everywhere. But they are both the same thing, right? Which is that they are artworks made in the space in which we inhabit. Now, you say, don't all artworks inhabit the space we do? Yes, they do. But let's face it, the space of a painting on the wall is very different than the space of sculpture, because sculpture is actually there. We could walk around it perhaps. We might be able to put our arms around it. We might, even if we can't, we know we could think about walking around it, right? Or think about something about its three-dimensionality. Whereas painting, even the most abstract painting, still depends on the fact that it's an illusory surface on the wall, right? It's different than the wall, but it's an illusory surface on the wall. Or if you think of something like say a photograph. A photograph is this kind of magic window into another time and space, right? Because we know it was taken at some time, generally, and obviously some place with a machine, and the artist controlled all that, but the fact is it's still this mysterious illusion on the paper or on the wall, however it's constructed. And of course, with sculpture, it's there in your space. But more importantly, it's there in your time. Because when you think about being here with one another, we know we're sharing the time together, right? And you know that you're eventually going to leave this room and you'll all wander about elsewhere, and you won't be sharing the time, but you knew you did and you knew you could again, right? I mean, God willing, and the creek don't rise. But with sculpture, it's much the same thing because it's in your space and hence is in your time, right? It doesn't exist in the mysterious and illusory time of a photograph. Yes, the photograph exists, but you're looking at a different time when you look at it, right? It's not like the time of watching a television show or a movie where time is thrust at you in a completely different way. But the sculpture is there and you're living with it, right, in your time, right? That's the difference to me. Installation, exactly the same thing. And a lot of people prefer to call it installation rather than sculpture all over the place, is because it's faster and easier, and it's now a term which everyone more or less understands and accepts. So it's just development of language in terms of definitions in art.
We come to the scale.
Scale in all art is crucial, right? And in my case, I work with initially when I started making works, and they were all quite small scale because it was actually comfortable and easy to do it, and in terms of expense for materials, it was not problematic, and one could, I was used to doing it. I sort of kind of continued doing it. But scale is crucial. Scale determines very much the impact of the work on the individual, so it's one of the practical considerations, but it's just one of them. It's like color, shape, material, whatever it might be, right? And so scale is important, but it isn't the only important aspect. It's just one of the many factors that you balance and you work with when you're making art, right? There's just any number of them that you have to deal with. So, there's no rule by which big is better than small, right? And there's kind of a joke, sort of aphorism that claims to be about photography. It says, if you can't make it good, make it big. And if you can't make it big, make it red, right? So, a bit cynical, but there's a certain amount of truth to that, as you can often see when you're looking at the work of younger artists. Questions often arise about the nature of how work is displayed in galleries. Because sculpture, when it comes into a gallery, is different than sculpture, for example, that one might encounter on the street. When you're encountering on the street, it's there in front of you, and we kind of just accept the way it is and deal with it the way it is. But if you're putting sculpture into a gallery, a number of other considerations have to become crucial. And one of them, for example, is particularly with the kind of work that I make, which often has intricate components or moving parts, is the safety of the viewing public and the responsibility the gallery has to, in a sense, safeguarding the object. So that quite often work is put on plinths or stands, or in the case of the show here, on very low-lying kinds of raised floors, about 8 inches above the ground. And they're done for practical reasons. I certainly don't have them on those kinds of devices when I'm making them in my shop, but for items like safety or practicality, or just ensuring that things don't get broken, it's often wise to put them on a plinth. And, but plinths are like tables. They're really just a way often of bringing a sculpture up to the viewing level you want, right? Or, if you look at it the other way, is taking your sculpture down to the ground so it's secure, right? Because it works both ways, right? There's not any particular way to view it that's right, but you have to consider both ways. And so in my case, there's one work which actually is made on a plinth, and I made the plinth myself, so it would be exactly right. For, again, reasons of practicality, that I wanted the sculpture to be viewed in its case at a particular height. And then the other practicality was that one of the mechanisms in it is actually quite delicate, and in order to make sure that it was going to be proper to have it viewed for a very long time, is I put it on a specially kind of timer that is often used in museums for kinetic displays or light displays, where you don't want things on all the time. You push a button, it goes on for 2 minutes, and then it shuts off, right? And of course it has to be made robust because school children come through here, and I don't know if you ever watched school children with a push button in a museum. It's boom, 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 you know, and so yeah, you have to just be prepared for those things, right? I like to think of plinths and those kinds of things as sensible furniture, right? And often help to frame the work. They often help to guide the viewer to understand the work better, but they're not done in a sense to aggrandize the work. They're actually done for very practical reasons. I think there's many, many ways of making art, and there's also many ways of viewing and appreciating art, right? At one time it was felt, certainly if you read some criticism in the about the mid part of the 20th century, is that somehow the idea that sculpture must be touchable, right? Well, that was one point of view, but I don't think it forms any kind of hard and fast rule. I just think it's one way that some people like to think about sculpture. And obviously in some cases that's very sensible and practical, although again, if you go to churches in Europe, you realize that even marble statues will wear away with people kissing the feet of the statue. Right? So, you know, there's practical reasons for not doing it. But I think that there's nothing wrong with either approach. There's just an approach.